I had never felt more alone or more afraid than I did that morning in May 2025 when I walked into the Fort Bragg Military Medical Clinic. The hallways smelled of antiseptic and polished linoleum, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights filled the space. My name is Captain Lillian Cross. I am 32 years old, and I have served in the United States Army for nearly 10 years. I had spent most of my adult life learning discipline and trust, but nothing had prepared me for the shock that was about to unfold. I was here for a routine gynecological checkup, a standard examination that every female soldier undergoes regularly. I told myself it would be nothing unusual, just another visit. But there was a knot in my stomach that morning, a sense of unease that I could not shake. The nurse led me to a small examination room and asked me to change into a medical gown. I tried to steady my breathing as I sat on the table, the fabric cold against my skin. The Army gynecologist entered, a tall man with a crisp uniform and a calm, serious expression. He greeted me politely and began the examination, asking about my symptoms and my medical history. I mentioned occasional abdominal discomfort, fatigue, and some irregularities in my cycle, but nothing I thought was alarming. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he paused when I mentioned that my stepfather had always accompanied me to family appointments and had access to some of my personal health records. I did not think much of it at the time, but he leaned back and set his instruments down and said in a low, serious voice, "Something is wrong with your body." I remember the words like a hammer to my chest. Something is wrong with your body. I did not understand at first what he meant, and I tried to laugh nervously to mask the panic rising inside me. His expression did not change. He was calm and professional, but there was a gravity in his tone that made me tremble. I felt a cold sweat run down my back, and the familiar world I had built for myself as a disciplined Army officer and as someone who thought she knew her family began to crack. I could not help but glance at the door and imagine my stepfather standing there, the man who had always been controlling and manipulative, the one who had subtly dictated my life and my choices. Was he responsible for something more sinister than I had ever imagined? I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as the doctor explained that he wanted to run additional tests. There was an urgency in his voice that made my stomach twist. Every instinct told me that this was not routine, that something had been happening behind the scenes that I had no knowledge of. I remembered the countless times my stepfather had reminded me of my place in the house, the way he monitored my interactions, the way he subtly undermined my confidence and independence, and now a chilling thought crept into my mind. Could he be involved in whatever was wrong with me? I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that I was imagining things, that this was probably a standard precaution, but the doctor's next words silenced me completely. He asked questions about my previous procedures and medications, and there was a pause when I mentioned my stepfather had been the one overseeing certain aspects of my care. His eyes widened slightly, and he shook his head, almost imperceptibly, and said, "We need to get a clearer picture." My pulse raced. I could feel every nerve ending alert. I felt both fear and a strange sense of betrayal and confusion. How could someone who claimed to care about me have access to my health records and yet have potentially caused harm? My thoughts spiraled into memories of subtle manipulations of my diet, my exercise routine, the medications I had been given, the advice I had been forced to follow under his watchful eye. I tried to ground myself and breathe, but the room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the doctor prepared the ultrasound equipment and blood work trays. I was instructed to lie back and focus on breathing, but my mind was racing, thinking about my family, about my stepfather, and about the uncertainty of what was to come. Every moment of silence was deafening, and I could hear only my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then the doctor placed the probe on my abdomen, and I watched the screen anxiously. The images flickered and shifted, and every change seemed ominous, every shadow on the monitor a possible threat to my health. I clenched my fists and held my breath when he adjusted the angle multiple times and finally stepped back to look at me, his jaw tight with tension and his eyes not meeting mine. He said, "Your body shows signs that are unusual, and we need to run a full spectrum of tests immediately." In that instant, I realized the world I thought I understood was no longer safe, and that someone I trusted may have been betraying me in ways I could not yet comprehend. I felt tears prick my eyes as a wave of panic and confusion rolled over me. I wanted to scream to run to my room to hide, but I remained frozen on the examination table. The doctor handed me a referral for urgent testing and hospitalization if necessary, and said that every day of delay could increase the risk of serious complications. The gravity of his words hit me like a physical blow, and I knew that my life had changed irrevocably in the space of one morning. I left the room with trembling hands, clutching the paperwork, my mind racing through every interaction with my stepfather, every subtle act of control, every smile that had masked manipulation and betrayal. I drove to my car, my hands shaking as the sun rose higher over Fort Bragg, the realization settling that I was alone facing something far larger than myself, something that threatened not just my health, but my autonomy, my very sense of safety and trust. I could feel both fear and determination battling within me. I would not be passive. I would not allow this to go unchecked. I would find the truth, no matter how devastating, and I would take action. Stay until the end, because what I am about to reveal will shock you, and you will understand why nothing in my life will ever be the same again. I had been living with a dull, constant ache in my lower abdomen for months, a pain that came and went in waves, sometimes sharp enough to make me double over. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was stress, or perhaps long hours of physical training at Fort Bragg taking their toll on my body. But as weeks turned into months, the discomfort grew harder to ignore. Along with the abdominal pain, I felt an unrelenting fatigue that made the most basic tasks exhausting. My energy for morning PT sessions diminished, my focus during briefings waned, and I often found myself struggling to keep up with my duties as a captain in the Army. At first, I chalked it up to long nights of paperwork and the constant pressure of leading a platoon, but deep inside, I knew something was off. My cycle had also become irregular, painful, unpredictable, and at times it left me feeling drained both physically and emotionally. I tried to explain it to myself as normal age-related changes, but a small voice inside whispered that it was more than that, that my body was sending a warning I could not ignore. I began to notice that my stepfather was always present in the background, offering advice about my diet, my exercise, and even my sleep schedule under the guise of care. He had always been controlling, but now it felt more invasive. I remember the subtle ways he would comment on my appearance, on my weight, or the tone in my voice, always steering my choices quietly but insistently. He never allowed me to question his suggestions or to seek second opinions. He made me feel that he knew better than any doctor or even than I knew myself. I began to wonder if my symptoms were somehow connected to his control, if the stress he imposed and the subtle manipulations had taken a physical toll on me. I had always known that he was a man who thrived on control, but the idea that it could manifest in something as intimate and personal as my health was terrifying. I recalled countless mornings where he would insist on accompanying me to family doctor visits, and the way he would subtly intercept information from my medical records, making me feel small and powerless. The contrast between the discipline I followed in my military duties and the lack of autonomy I experienced at home was stark. In the Army, I was trained to make decisions, to assess risks, and to lead my team with confidence and authority. But at home, I felt constantly monitored, second-guessed, and restricted. It was exhausting both mentally and physically. As the weeks passed, I started keeping a journal of my symptoms, noting the days the pain was worst, the hours when my fatigue peaked, and the subtle changes I noticed in my body. I recorded the times when my stepfather made seemingly innocuous comments that left me anxious, or when he questioned why I needed to consult a physician. Reviewing these notes, I began to see a pattern, a connection that I could not ignore. The physical symptoms seemed to coincide with moments when his influence was strongest and when I had no privacy to discuss my health openly. Emotional undulation became a constant in my life, the fear, the doubt, the anxiety, the hope that maybe this was all in my head, and the crushing realization that it was not. I confided in a trusted colleague in the Army, someone I knew would understand the delicate balance of authority and independence. I explained the fatigue, the pain, the changes in my body, and how my stepfather's presence made everything more complicated. Her reaction confirmed my suspicions. She listened carefully and then said that while stress could certainly manifest physically, it sounded like there was more going on, something that warranted further examination, and that my stepfather's behavior was concerning. This affirmation was both relieving and frightening. It gave me courage, but also reinforced the need for vigilance. I began to notice the subtle ways my stepfather tried to control my access to information about my health. He would question bills for medications, discourage me from attending follow-up appointments, and insist that he knew the best treatment for me. The thought that he could be interfering with my health care filled me with dread, but also with a determination I had not felt before. I realized that if I did not take control of the situation, no one else would. I was living in two worlds: the structured, disciplined environment of the Army where every decision I made mattered, and a home where my autonomy was constantly undermined. The conflict between these two spheres created a tension that I could not ignore. Each day I went to training or carried out my duties, I felt the lingering weight of my body reminding me of the unseen threat within. Emotional undulation intensified the fear of what could happen if I did not act, the rising anger at being manipulated, the creeping sense of betrayal, and the growing resolve that I would no longer be passive. I started making plans to see a military gynecologist independently, someone who had no connection to my stepfather, who could examine me and uncover the truth. Each symptom, each pang of discomfort, each exhausted evening strengthened my resolve. I wanted answers, and I knew that whatever the results would be, I had to face them head on. The tension between my service and my family life had reached a breaking point, and I could no longer pretend that everything was under control. I felt both terror and anticipation as I prepared for the next medical appointment, unsure of what would be revealed, but certain that my life was about to change. I knew that whatever truth the military gynecologist uncovered, it could not be ignored, and that it might expose things far beyond my own health. The shadow of my stepfather's control loomed large, but the determination to reclaim my autonomy and to confront whatever was hidden within my life pushed me forward. Every mile I drove toward the clinic, my chest tightened and my mind raced, thinking of the months of subtle abuse, the uncertainty about my body, and the looming possibility that my stepfather's hidden actions had consequences far beyond what I had imagined. I could feel both fear and courage mingling within me. The stage was set for a revelation that would change everything, and nothing in my life would ever be the same again. I sat nervously on the examination table at Fort Bragg as the Army gynecologist prepared the ultrasound equipment. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the steady hum of the air conditioning did little to calm the racing of my heart. My palms were damp and my stomach twisted in knots, a mix of anticipation and fear. I had spent months ignoring the dull, persistent ache and fatigue, telling myself it was just stress, or the cumulative toll of years of military training, but deep down, I had known there was more to it. Now, I had finally allowed someone independent of my stepfather's influence to examine me, and the reality of what could be found terrified me. The doctor instructed me to lie back, placing the probe gently against my abdomen, and my mind drifted to all the months of uncertainty, the sleepless nights, the exhaustion, and the silent anxiety that had followed me home from the barracks. I tried to take deep breaths, but every thought of my stepfather's constant oversight made my chest tighten even more. The screen flickered with the black and white images of my internal organs, and the doctor's eyes narrowed in concentration. He adjusted angles, examined the patterns, and I could see the tension in his jaw even as he maintained professional composure. I wanted to look away to convince myself that nothing serious could be wrong, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. The doctor finally pulled back the probe and asked me gently about my symptoms, repeating the questions about the pain, fatigue, and changes I had experienced. I answered as calmly as I could, trying to suppress the trembling in my voice. Then he said that he wanted to run additional blood work and inflammatory markers immediately. There was an urgency in his tone that made me sit up straighter and my stomach churn. When the nurse brought the tray for the blood draw, I felt every muscle in my body tense, imagining what the results might show and dreading the possibility that my stepfather's interference in my life had gone beyond manipulation into actual harm. The procedure was swift and professional, but each passing second felt like an eternity as my thoughts spiraled. My mind replayed every instance of subtle control, every intercepted phone call, every dismissed concern about my health that my stepfather had orchestrated over the years. I thought about the afternoons when he would insist on accompanying me to appointments, the way he would question medications, the comments on my energy levels, my appearance, and my choices. Now, for the first time, I realized that his influence might have affected my body in ways I had never imagined, and I felt a sense of dread that I could not shake. The Army gynecologist returned a short time later with the test results, and his expression was serious, professional, but the gravity in his eyes made my heart sink. He explained that the imaging and lab work showed abnormalities that had been present for months, if not longer changes that could not be attributed to physical training or stress. My chest tightened, and I felt a wave of nausea as I tried to process his words. The pain and fatigue that I had endured were not normal. They were not a simple consequence of military life. Something had been happening within my body, and the prolonged nature of it made it clear that it was serious. He emphasized that delaying further evaluation could have dire consequences, that even a single day could increase risks and complicate treatment. I could feel panic rising, but I forced myself to stay calm and to focus on the steps ahead. I had to understand what was happening, and I had to face the reality of it, even if it shattered the world I had built around my family. My mind flashed to my stepfather. Could he be responsible for this? Was this another manifestation of the control and manipulation I had suspected for months? A cold fear gripped me as I remembered his constant supervision and the subtle ways he had shaped my life under the guise of care. I felt betrayed, angry, and helpless all at once. The doctor noticed my tension and gently assured me that I was taking the right steps by seeking a second opinion and by allowing the tests to be conducted independently. He said that he would schedule a follow-up to review the results more comprehensively, but the preliminary findings were already alarming enough to warrant immediate attention. I tried to ground myself, telling myself that panic would not solve anything and that I needed to stay alert and rational. But the thought that someone I trusted could have been involved in any harm to me made my stomach twist with fear. My thoughts alternated between disbelief and anger, my mind racing with scenarios and explanations trying to make sense of the results. The emotional undulation was overwhelming. I doubted my family, my stepfather's intentions, and the safety of my own body. The realization that I could no longer rely on him for guidance or protection was a hard pill to swallow. I thought about the months of subtle coercion, the hidden control, and now I had tangible proof that something was very wrong. I felt a mixture of dread and a flicker of determination rising within me. The results confirmed my suspicions that my body had been under stress and influence beyond what was normal, and the fear of what might come next spurred a resolve that I had not known I possessed. I would not be passive. I would not allow this to continue unchecked. I needed answers, I needed clarity, and I needed to reclaim control over my life. Every passing second reinforced the urgency of taking action. I left the clinic that day with a sense of fragile clarity, knowing that the coming days would be filled with revelations that could shatter my perception of family, of trust, and of my own life. The dread of what I might discover about my stepfather's involvement was balanced by a growing determination to confront the truth and to ensure that justice and accountability were not only sought, but achieved. I felt my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve, knowing that the path ahead would be difficult, emotionally draining, and full of unexpected challenges, but also knowing that I had the courage and intelligence to face whatever came next. The Army gynecologist's words echoed in my mind, reminding me of the urgency of action and the reality that my life and health could not be ignored or delayed. This was no longer just about pain and fatigue. It was about uncovering the hidden manipulations that had infiltrated my life and reclaiming the autonomy and safety that I had been denied for far too long. After the unnerving results from the Army gynecologist, I returned to my quarters at Fort Bragg, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. I needed to understand the extent of what had been happening with my body, and I knew that my stepfather's influence over my life could be part of the problem. I opened my personal laptop and accessed the secure military health portal where my medical records were stored. It was a space I had trusted for years, assuming the information there reflected the truth about my health. But as I began scrolling through the charts and lab results, something immediately felt off. Certain appointments that I remembered clearly were missing entirely. Notes from routine checkups were incomplete or contained vague entries that did not match the conversations I had had with my doctors. I noticed that some documents had been time-stamped in ways that did not correspond with my memory of events, and medications that I knew I had been prescribed were either missing or recorded incorrectly. My heart sank as I realized that these inconsistencies were not random errors. They suggested deliberate tampering. A chill ran down my spine as the thought occurred to me that someone with access to these records had intentionally altered them. My stepfather had always been meticulous, always wanting to know every detail about my schedule, my health, my interactions, and now it seemed that this meticulousness had crossed a dangerous line. I remembered the countless times he had subtly reminded me to allow him access to my medical information, saying it was for my safety or to make sure I was following the proper protocols. I had accepted it at the time, thinking it was a form of care, but now the pieces were coming together. Each discrepancy in the files felt like a small betrayal, a puzzle piece pointing toward the larger picture I was only beginning to understand. I felt my stomach tighten with a combination of dread and anger as I considered the possibility that he had been manipulating my health records all along. My mind raced through the months of fatigue, the persistent pain, the unexplained discomfort. Could he have known and done nothing? Could he have interfered in ways that were actively harmful? I remembered the subtle discouragement when I had asked about second opinions, the way he would question my need for certain medical procedures and insist that he knew what was best. Now, looking at the files, those moments felt sinister in hindsight. I knew that Stepfather had a background that gave him certain access within the military infrastructure, the ability to monitor or even modify aspects of my health records remotely, ostensibly for my safety, but potentially for control. My pulse quickened as I imagined him reviewing these records from the comfort of his home, while I endured unexplained symptoms and escalating anxiety. I felt both fear and a rising sense of betrayal as the reality began to crystallize in my mind. I realized that this was not about minor oversight or clerical errors. It was a deliberate intrusion into the most personal and vulnerable parts of my life. My emotions oscillated wildly as I scrolled through the files, each anomaly a confirmation of what I had feared but could not yet fully articulate. Shock, disbelief, anger, and a growing sense of urgency combined to create a whirlwind of emotion that left me momentarily breathless. I started to take screenshots and notes, every anomaly, every missing entry, every unexplained timestamp. This was my first step in gathering evidence and reclaiming control over my life. I needed to document everything meticulously because I knew that confronting the truth would require more than gut feelings. I had to have proof. As I worked, I felt a mixture of fear and empowerment, knowing that uncovering these discrepancies was the first step in taking back my autonomy. The suspense of not knowing exactly what my stepfather had done or intended heightened my anxiety, but also sharpened my focus. Each discovery seemed to raise more questions than answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. I tried to focus on the facts, the data, the concrete evidence, rather than the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm me. Still, I could not ignore the creeping realization that my body and my life may have been subject to manipulation for months, if not years. The emotional undulation of this experience was exhausting. I went from fear to anger, to a cold, strategic thinking, and back to fear as I considered the implications of what I was discovering. I knew that confronting my stepfather directly would be dangerous without preparation, and that I needed allies. I began drafting a plan to consult the Army gynecologist again to discuss these discrepancies and to seek guidance from a legal and military perspective. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. I had to protect myself both physically and emotionally and ensure that no further harm could come from the hidden influence that had been exerted over me. Yet even as I tried to organize my thoughts and make practical plans, a part of me could not shake the personal sting of betrayal. The man I had grown up with, the man who claimed to have my best interests at heart, may have been the architect of some of my most troubling experiences. The sense of being manipulated, of having my personal health compromised, was overwhelming. Each anomaly in the files seemed to scream his involvement, and I could feel the betrayal cutting deeper than I had expected. Despite the fear I felt, I also felt a spark of determination. I would not allow this to continue. I would uncover the truth. I would confront my stepfather not with blind anger, but with evidence and strategy. I had spent years training my body and mind in the Army to face challenges under pressure, and now that training was about to be tested in a very personal and dangerous way. The room felt smaller as I sat at the computer, the weight of the months of abuse and manipulation pressing down on me. Each click of the mouse, each screenshot I captured was a step toward reclaiming my life and autonomy. I could not predict what would happen next or how my stepfather would react when confronted. But for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope mixed with righteous anger. I knew that uncovering the truth was the only path forward, and that no matter the outcome, I would be prepared to take action to protect myself and ensure that justice was served. The betrayal I felt was immense, and my body trembled with a mixture of fear and determination as I realized that the next steps would set the stage for a confrontation that could change everything in my life. After discovering the unsettling discrepancies in my military health records at Fort Bragg, I knew I could not rely solely on the information I had. The thought that my stepfather might have been tampering with my files, influencing my appointments, or controlling the information I received filled me with both dread and a burning need for clarity. I needed a second opinion, someone completely independent of him, and someone whose authority I could trust implicitly. After some research and a few calls through military channels, I arranged an appointment with a gynecologist stationed at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, a respected physician with extensive experience in women's health within the military. The drive from Fort Bragg to Camp Lejeune was long enough for me to sit in silence, wrestling with the flood of emotions and possibilities. My mind cycled endlessly through every suspicious moment, every odd comment from my stepfather, every strange pattern in my health records. Fear alternated with anger, and then a chilling clarity something had been wrong for a long time, and it was no longer just a theory. It demanded action. Upon arrival at the clinic, the calm efficiency of the medical staff provided a small measure of comfort, but I could not shake the tension building inside me. As I was led into the examination room and asked to change into a gown, I reflected on the months of abdominal discomfort, fatigue, and irregular cycles, and I wondered how much longer I could have ignored these symptoms if I had trusted only the guidance I had received from my stepfather. The doctor entered shortly afterward, a composed woman in her early 40s with a warm but professional demeanor. She introduced herself, listened intently as I recounted my symptoms and the troubling discoveries in my health records, and nodded thoughtfully. I noticed that her eyes flickered with concern when I mentioned the irregularities and the possibility that someone with access to my military health information might have been interfering. She assured me that we would take a full look at my history and conduct comprehensive examinations and tests to get a clear understanding of what was happening with my body. The initial physical examination was meticulous. She palpated, listened, and carefully documented my symptoms while I tried to remain calm, though I could feel the anxiety coiling in my chest like a spring. When the ultrasound machine was wheeled in, my heart pounded in my ears. I tried to breathe steadily, focusing on the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft instructions of the nurse. The doctor positioned the probe gently and began scanning while explaining in a calm voice each step of the process. Her professionalism reassured me, yet every shadow and flicker on the screen sent a jolt of fear through me. After adjusting the angle and reviewing multiple images, she leaned back slightly, her expression serious and unreadable. She explained that there were indeed abnormalities that had persisted for months and could not be explained by normal physiological changes or the physical demands of military training. I felt a cold shiver run through me. The pain, fatigue, and irregularities I had endured were not just stress or overexertion. There was an underlying problem, a threat to my long-term health that had been masked, ignored, or manipulated by someone who claimed to care for me. My pulse raced as she spoke, emphasizing the potential risks and the importance of prompt follow-up testing. Each word felt heavy, laden with urgency and warning. The emotional undulation was almost unbearable. I swung from shock to disbelief to a growing sense of dread. I could barely process that someone I had trusted could have been involved in causing or masking a medical condition that had silently threatened me for months. She recommended additional tests, including inflammatory markers and a comprehensive panel to assess for any chronic underlying issues. She explained the need to act quickly and that delaying could increase the risk of complications. My mind was racing. Every scenario I had feared was suddenly plausible. I remembered the months of subtle manipulation by my stepfather, the dinners where he pressed me to skip appointments, the casual questioning about my symptoms, the insistence that he knew best. The image of him smiling as he controlled my access to information filled me with a mix of anger, fear, and a desire for confrontation. I realized that I could no longer be passive. The results of this second opinion were confirming suspicions that I had quietly nurtured for months but had been too afraid to articulate. It was no longer a question of what if, but what now. The doctor continued to explain the findings in detail, carefully highlighting the areas of concern, the patterns in my symptoms, and the possible long-term consequences if the condition was left unaddressed. Each explanation was like a hammer to my chest, driving home the reality that I had been subjected to a subtle but insidious form of control, and that my health had been compromised. I felt both horror and determination rise simultaneously within me. The horror was raw and immediate, the betrayal, the possible consequences for my body, the months of pain that could have been prevented. The determination was strategic, calculated. I would gather evidence, confront the person responsible, and ensure that justice was served. I left the clinic that afternoon feeling shaken but resolute. I knew that the next steps were critical and that the road ahead would require courage, strategy, and unwavering focus. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of empowerment. I had taken action independent of the stepfather's influence, sought out credible advice, and now had confirmation that my concerns were valid. Yet, even in that empowerment, there lingered a profound sadness. I had been betrayed, manipulated, and controlled in the one area of life that should have been completely my own, my body, and my health. Driving back toward Fort Bragg, I replayed every moment in my mind and considered the careful steps I would need to take to protect myself, gather further evidence, and confront the truth. The emotional undulation continued: fear, disbelief, anger, determination, and a glimmer of cautious hope. I knew that uncovering the truth about my stepfather's interference in my health and the manipulations I had endured was only the first step in reclaiming my life. I had to act strategically, thoughtfully, and decisively. My mind raced with possibilities, strategies, and the evidence I would need. This was not just about a medical condition. It was about exposing a betrayal that had reached into the core of my autonomy. I had survived countless challenges in my military career, faced dangerous training exercises, life-threatening missions, and high-stress leadership situations. Yet this challenge felt different. It was deeply personal, intimate, and required a combination of emotional fortitude, strategic thinking, and courage. I realized that the journey ahead would test every skill I had honed in the Army and push me to my limits. But I also knew that if I did nothing, I would remain trapped in a life where my health and autonomy were compromised by someone I should have been able to trust. I tightened my grip on my car keys as I parked outside the base and took a deep breath. I whispered to myself that I would not be passive. I would seek justice and reclaim control. Have you ever trusted someone completely only to have doubts? That question lingered in my mind as I stepped out of the car, knowing that the next chapters of my life would demand courage, vigilance, and resolve like never before. After the second opinion at Camp Lejeune, the urgency in my chest did not fade. If anything, it intensified. I knew that understanding the truth was no longer enough. I had to gather concrete evidence before confronting my stepfather or involving the military chain of command. Every interaction with him over the years had shown me that he was meticulous, clever, and dangerously strategic. I needed to be smarter and more methodical if I wanted to protect myself and ensure accountability. I returned to my quarters at Fort Bragg and began meticulously documenting every anomaly I had found in my health records. I printed copies of the medical files, screenshots from the secure portal, and detailed notes from both gynecologists. Each piece of paper I handled carried weight, a tangible reminder that my health and autonomy had been compromised. But this was only the beginning. I had to connect the dots, understand how and when my stepfather had interfered, and gather evidence strong enough to stand up in any official investigation. I began by reconstructing my typical weeks over the past year. I noted appointments, medical visits, and conversations about medications. I cross-referenced them with emails and messages where he had been present or had oversight. Every discrepancy was highlighted. I paid attention to subtle comments, casual directives, and moments when he subtly discouraged me from asking questions or seeking second opinions. Each one was a thread in a web of manipulation, and I needed to trace it carefully. My next step was to access my personal email and communications within the military network, where some of my notifications and health updates were delivered. I knew he sometimes had access, or at least oversight, through shared family accounts or base-connected devices. I downloaded and backed up every message, every alert, and every piece of correspondence that could illustrate interference or control. Some messages were innocuous, but others revealed his subtle influence, reminders and instructions that I had once taken for granted as care or guidance. As I organized the files into folders labeled by date and topic, I realized how much of my life he had quietly monitored. The realization brought both a sense of betrayal and a cold clarity I had to proceed carefully but decisively. Over the next several days, I began observing his patterns more closely, noting his routines when he checked the computer, when he made comments about my appointments, and even when he seemed unusually aware of my interactions with medical staff. The tension mounted. Every glance he threw in my direction, every casual question about my day, felt loaded with suspicion. I had to maintain my composure while stealthily gathering information. The juxtaposition of fear and determination became almost unbearable. I was afraid of being discovered, afraid of what he might do if he realized I had concrete evidence, but at the same time, each new piece of information reinforced my resolve. I began compiling a detailed timeline of interactions notes from appointments, screenshots of emails, and scanned copies of military forms that had been altered or left incomplete. My strategy was to create a clear, organized, and irrefutable record of interference and potential misconduct. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous it became. I could sense that he was becoming suspicious. Subtle changes in his behavior, an unusually close watch on my routines, and the occasional pointed comment suggested that he knew something had shifted. The fear of confrontation loomed over me, but it also sharpened my focus. I reminded myself that in the Army I had been trained to handle high-pressure situations strategically and methodically. I drew on that training now, meticulously planning each step of gathering evidence while ensuring that he could not detect my activities prematurely. I even began backing up copies of critical files to a secure external drive that he had no access to, anticipating potential attempts to delete or alter information if he realized what I was doing. Every action felt calculated, deliberate, and necessary. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, of who was in the room, of any possibility that he could intercept or manipulate the evidence. The emotional undulation was intense. Fear surged when I thought of being caught. Anger flared at the betrayal I had endured, but determination and strategic clarity overrode the panic. I had to see this through. My military training proved invaluable. I approached the evidence collection like a mission, mapping out objectives, potential obstacles, and contingencies. I scheduled times to review files when I was alone, ensured backups were secure, and documented every suspicious interaction with him in my private journal. The more evidence I collected, the more confident I became that I could confront the situation with authority and clarity. The thought that my stepfather had been manipulating my health and controlling information all this time made my stomach churn, but it also fueled a fierce determination. I could feel the transformation within me. The powerless, anxious young woman who had suffered in silence was giving way to a smart, brave, and strategic operator who would not be deterred by intimidation or fear. Even as I worked, I was aware that each day brought increased risk. He was perceptive, and I sensed his growing suspicion. I knew that if he realized what I was doing, he might attempt to destroy evidence or intimidate me further. That awareness kept me vigilant and precise in my actions. The tension in the household was palpable. Casual questions about appointments, pointed remarks about my routines, and his ever-watchful presence reminded me that this was no longer just about my health, but about power control and uncovering the truth behind months of manipulation. I could feel the adrenaline surge as I documented each anomaly, each suspicious action, each altered file. The stakes were high, but I also recognized that I was gaining ground slowly but surely, assembling a body of evidence that could not be ignored. By the end of the week, I had a detailed chronological record of his interference supporting medical evidence from 2 independent Army gynecologists and secure backups of all pertinent communications. I finally allowed myself a brief moment of pride, though tempered with apprehension for having taken control of the situation and prepared for the confrontation that lay ahead. I was no longer just a passive participant in my own life. I had become the strategist, the investigator, the soldier who would face an insidious threat with courage and precision. I knew the next steps would be critical, the confrontation unavoidable, and the exposure necessary. I could feel the weight of the months of manipulation beginning to lift as I realized that with this evidence, I was no longer powerless. The suspense, the fear, and the anticipation of revealing the truth combined into a quiet resolve. I had taken the first decisive actions toward reclaiming my autonomy and ensuring that justice would be served. As I delved deeper into the files I had gathered, a creeping sense of dread grew in my chest. The screenshots, printouts, and journal entries were only the beginning. I had a hunch that there was more evidence hidden, something that would reveal the true extent of my stepfather's interference. I remembered an old storage cabinet in my family home, a place he rarely allowed me to access, but one I had managed to reach during a brief moment when he was away. Inside, I found a collection of folders, many of them filled with military-related documents, appointment logs, and notes he had kept meticulously over the years. At first glance, the contents appeared mundane, administrative, even helpful, but as I sifted through the pages, the chilling truth began to take shape. There were detailed annotations about my medical visits, not only in the context of normal health tracking, but in the way he had monitored delayed or manipulated treatments. Dates of appointments were crossed out. Explanations for symptoms were rewritten in his handwriting, and directives he had given to medical staff were documented as though they were official orders. The more I read, the colder my blood ran. He had been controlling my health systematically, ensuring that certain symptoms went uninvestigated and subtly interfering with decisions that should have been mine to make. This was not a matter of care. It was a calculated, methodical undermining of my autonomy and my well-being. I found logs indicating that he had requested follow-up tests be postponed, records altered, and even communications with independent Army medical personnel intercepted. The implications were horrifying. My fatigue, abdominal pain, and other unexplained symptoms were not merely neglected, they had been deliberately influenced to mask something deeper. My mind raced as I connected the dots. The months of unexplained health issues, the inconsistencies in my medical records, the barriers to independent medical evaluation all pointed to a single conclusion: my stepfather had orchestrated a campaign to control my health and monitor my every move. This was not about anything sexual as I had feared at first. It was about domination, manipulation, and ensuring that I remained under his control, both at home and within my professional life in the Army. A cold rage swept over me. This was betrayal on a scale I had never imagined. The man I had trusted, the one who had posed as a supportive parental figure, had covertly undermined my ability to function, to thrive, and to make autonomous decisions. My chest tightened as shock gave way to outrage. How could someone be so meticulous, so strategic, and so cruel? I flipped through more folders and came across notes detailing my performance at Fort Bragg, my fitness assessments, and even feedback from supervisors. My stepfather had not only interfered with my health, but had also attempted to sabotage my military career subtly. Recommendations had been crossed out, commendations delayed, and in some instances he had suggested interventions to military personnel under the guise of concern for my well-being. I could feel bile rising as the realization sank in he had been attacking both my physical health and my career strategically with calculated precision. Each revelation stoked a mixture of fear and determination. The emotional undulation intensified. I was horrified, betrayed, and enraged, but also clearer than ever about the necessity of acting. I could no longer view this as passive mismanagement. It was deliberate. I knew that the evidence I now held was damning not only for his actions but also for his intentions. My stepfather had created a web of control spanning years, manipulating my life in ways I had only begun to understand. I sat at the table sifting through annotations that described how he had monitored my appointments to ensure I remained compliant, how he had subtly delayed certain treatments, and how he had exerted influence over medical personnel to maintain oversight. The level of premeditation was staggering. I realized that if I did nothing, he would continue to control, manipulate, and undermine my health and career indefinitely. I thought of my colleagues, my platoon, and the integrity I had built over a decade of service. This was not only a personal betrayal, it was an attack on my professional life. Every note, every log entry, every altered record painted a picture of methodical cruelty. My stepfather had created conditions that endangered my health and limited my career potential, and he had done so with a chilling calmness and precision. I felt both disgust and an icy determination. I would not allow him to continue, and I would ensure that he was held accountable. My hands shook as I photographed the documents, organized them, and backed them up securely. Each action was a strategic move, a calculated step toward exposing the truth. I knew that confronting him directly without preparation would be reckless. I needed a plan supported by evidence, a strategy that leveraged both the documentation I had gathered and the medical confirmations I had obtained. As I reviewed the files, I also realized that his interference had left traces that could be traced and verified. Dates, annotations, and references provided a timeline of deliberate actions. I began organizing everything chronologically, piecing together the narrative that would leave no doubt about his intent and his manipulations. The weight of betrayal mixed with the surge of empowerment. I was scared, yes, but I was also mobilized. The cognitive dissonance of having trusted someone who had methodically undermined my autonomy faded in the face of this clarity. I could see a path forward. The shock of discovering his hidden agenda was compounded by the sheer audacity of it. He had taken advantage of my trust, my discipline, and my commitment to the Army. He had used information influence and intimidation as weapons. And yet, despite this, I felt a sense of strategic purpose settling over me. I would not allow fear to paralyze me. I would gather evidence, confront the situation with authority, and ensure justice was served. As I finalized the organization of the files, I could almost anticipate the moment when I would present this evidence, the moment when the truth would be undeniable, the moment when the betrayal could no longer hide behind a facade of concern. The mixture of fear, outrage, and determination became almost intoxicating. I knew that the path forward would be difficult, emotionally taxing, and fraught with risk, but also that I had finally uncovered the core of the deception and could act with precision. The stepfather who had seemed omnipotent in his control over my life now had a vulnerability, the truth, and I would wield it carefully but decisively. My body trembled with the adrenaline of revelation and the weight of the months of manipulation. I was enraged, but I was also clear-eyed, calculating, and ready to act. The hidden agenda had been revealed, and now it was my turn to respond. This was not a fight about emotion alone. It was a battle for autonomy, justice, and my life, and I would not lose. The day I decided to confront my stepfather, I felt a storm of emotions swirling inside me: fear, anger, betrayal, and determination. For months, I had meticulously gathered evidence, documented every irregularity in my health records, collected screenshots, medical reports, and the damning notes from his hidden files. Now finally, it was time to face the man who had manipulated, controlled, and endangered me for years. I entered the house with a sense of cold purpose, every step deliberate, my hands steady even though my chest felt heavy. He was in the living room reading a newspaper, looking entirely unsuspecting, the same calm demeanor he had perfected over decades. My stomach twisted as I approached him, the files clutched in my hands. The anger I had been holding at bay surged forward. I laid the folder on the table in front of him and met his gaze directly. I know everything I said, my voice steady but carrying an edge of controlled fury. Every manipulation, every interference, every time you compromised my health and career. His eyes flickered with something between surprise and irritation, and he immediately tried to regain control of the situation. "Lillian, what are you talking about?" he asked, his tone deliberately casual. I could see the slight tightening around his eyes, the micro-expressions that betrayed him. I laid out the evidence piece by piece, chronological, irrefutable. The altered medical records, the annotations he had made in his personal folders, the missed appointments, the delays, the directives to staff, the intercepted communications, all of it was there on the table in black and white. I watched as his face shifted from disbelief to alarm to fury. He opened his mouth to speak, to deflect, to deny, but I cut him off. "Do not try to manipulate this, not now. You thought you could control every aspect of my life, my health, and even my career. You underestimated me. You thought no one would notice. I noticed. I am prepared." His voice grew sharp, defensive. "Lillian, you are misinterpreting this. These are misunderstandings, nothing deliberate. You are letting paranoia control your mind." I shook my head, my fingers clenching. "Misunderstandings. Is that what you call deliberately interfering with my medical care? Delaying appointments and altering files? Is that what you call controlling access to my information so that I would suffer in silence while you maintained authority?" He leaned back, attempting to appear calm, but the tension radiated from him in waves. "You are exaggerating. You have no proof of intent. You are overreacting." "I have only acted for your benefit," he said, trying to assert dominance and maintain his facade. I felt a flash of disbelief and then a surge of defiance. The man I had trusted, who had posed as a caring father figure, had tried to control my entire existence and now had the audacity to claim it was for my own good. "For my benefit," I said, my voice rising slightly. "You call controlling my health, undermining my career, and manipulating medical professionals for years' benefit. I trusted you. I allowed you access, and this is how you repaid that trust." I laid another set of documents on the table. Email threads showing his instructions to staff, reports of delayed procedures, and notes. He had made instructing me to follow his guidance rather than seek independent care. His hands clenched into fists, a subtle tremor betraying his composure. "These are circumstantial," he said, trying to downplay the mountain of evidence. I leaned forward, my gaze locked on his. "Do not underestimate me. These are not circumstantial. These are actions documented in your own handwriting and your own directives. Every manipulation, every delay, every interference is here." The room felt charged, the air thick with tension. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, adrenaline and anger mingling into a cold clarity. I realized in that moment that the illusion of the man I had thought I knew, the protector, the caring authority, was shattered. What remained was a manipulator, a person who had used authority and trust as tools to control me. I allowed myself a brief pause to observe him. There was fear now creeping in, despite his attempts to appear composed. His mask had begun to slip, and for the first time in years I held the upper hand. I felt an unexpected surge of empowerment. No longer was I the passive victim. I was the strategist, the investigator, the captain in command of her own life. He leaned forward, his tone dropping into a warning. "Lillian, you are making a mistake. This can ruin both of us. You do not know what you are doing." I met his words with icy determination. "I know exactly what I am doing. I am reclaiming my life. I am ensuring that every action you took to harm me is exposed, and I will not be intimidated. You have underestimated my resolve, and that ends today." His eyes narrowed, and a shadow of menace passed over his face. I could feel the tension spike the danger implicit in his gaze. But I refused to retreat. I had anticipated this, prepared for it, and I had the evidence to back every claim. He tried one last time to assert control, threatening consequences, leveraging guilt, and hinting at potential social and professional damage. I listened without flinching. "Your threats do not scare me," I said quietly but firmly. "You have weaponized trust and authority against me for too long. Now I am taking control, and there will be accountability." As I stood up, the weight of the confrontation settled over me. Months of fear, suspicion, and subtle manipulation culminated in this moment. I felt a cold but exhilarating clarity. I was no longer powerless. The next steps were clear: document everything, involve the necessary authorities, and expose the truth strategically. I left the room not in triumph but in calm determination, a captain poised to reclaim her life, health, and career. The first confrontation had ended, but the battle was far from over. I knew that this encounter had shifted the dynamic irrevocably. I had planted the seeds of exposure and justice, and now it was only a matter of executing the plan. The betrayal had been revealed, and my resolve to act was unshakable. Every ounce of fear, anger, and disbelief had been transformed into strategic purpose. I would not allow manipulation, control, or abuse to continue unchecked. I would ensure that every violation of trust and autonomy was documented and confronted. My body, my career, and my life were mine to reclaim, and the stepfather who had sought to control me would soon face the consequences of his actions. After the first confrontation with my stepfather, I knew I could not proceed alone. The evidence I had gathered was damning, yet the stakes were high. I was dealing with someone who had authority, influence, and a calculated ability to manipulate those around me. I needed institutional support, legal guidance, and the protection that only formal channels could provide. My first call was to the Army Judge Advocate General Office. I explained the situation calmly, emphasizing that I had documented proof of interference with my health records, obstruction of medical care, and manipulations that could have compromised both my personal well-being and my military career. The JAG officer listened carefully, asking detailed questions about dates, emails, medical reports, and interactions with my stepfather. I provided the documents I had backed up securely: photographs of altered files, screenshots, and detailed chronological notes. The officer acknowledged the severity of the situation and confirmed that if verified, my stepfather's actions could constitute violations of military law, including dereliction of duty, unauthorized interference with personnel, and potential endangerment of a service member's health. I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that my concerns were being taken seriously, and apprehension at the potential repercussions and the extent to which he might try to retaliate. The next step was to involve the Military Medical Command. I contacted the Army Medical Command and arranged a confidential meeting with the personnel responsible for oversight of military health records and patient safety. I explained the discrepancies I had discovered, the evidence of manipulation, and the steps my stepfather had allegedly taken to control or interfere with my care. They reviewed the documentation I provided and expressed concern that if these actions were intentional, they could have severe consequences for both my stepfather's military career and his civilian accountability. Their recognition that the matter fell under both military law and medical ethics reinforced the gravity of the situation. I realized that the network of oversight within the military was my safeguard, but I also understood that the process could be slow and procedural, requiring patience, precision, and meticulous documentation. I began coordinating with a military attorney assigned to my case, who specialized in personnel and medical law. The lawyer guided me on the steps I needed to take to preserve evidence, maintain security over my files, and prepare for potential interviews with investigators. Each meeting, each discussion reinforced my awareness that I was dealing with a calculated manipulator and that moving strategically was essential. I also reached out to the Office of the Inspector General, explaining the situation and providing a summary of the evidence. Their interest confirmed that the allegations were being taken seriously at the highest levels, and that there was a process in place to investigate violations of military law and medical ethics. As the investigation began, I felt the tension inside me oscillating between fear and empowerment. Fear that my stepfather would retaliate, interfere further, or attempt to obscure the evidence. Empowerment in knowing that I was no longer alone and that formal channels existed to hold him accountable. I was reminded of the disciplined strategic thinking and resilience I had developed in the Army. I drew on these skills, now applying them to protect myself and navigate the complex intersection of personal betrayal, health concerns, and military law. I organized my evidence, meticulously labeling folders, creating timelines, and cross-referencing medical records with communications and appointment logs. Each piece reinforced the narrative of deliberate interference and potential harm. The process was painstaking, but I understood that every detail mattered. I spent hours reviewing emails, medical logs, and correspondence, noting patterns and anomalies that highlighted the deliberate nature of his actions. I also began keeping a personal journal, documenting interactions with investigators, meetings with JAG officers, and any suspicious behavior from my stepfather. This record was both a tool and a safeguard. As the investigation progressed, I noticed subtle changes in my stepfather's behavior. He seemed more alert, more cautious, and occasionally glanced at me in ways that suggested suspicion. It was a small but powerful confirmation that he sensed the tide turning, that the evidence he thought was hidden was now being reviewed by authorities. The psychological impact was significant. I had felt powerless for months, even years, under his subtle control and manipulation. Now, through strategic action and the support of military, legal, and medical authorities, I began to feel the shift. Empowerment replaced helplessness, and determination replaced fear. I was no longer at the mercy of his schemes. Every meeting with the JAG, every document reviewed by the medical oversight team, every note taken by investigators was a step toward reclaiming control over my life, health, and career. I also realized the importance of patience. The process would take time, and the steps needed to ensure accountability could not be rushed. I focused on precision, on ensuring that every piece of evidence was secure, accurate, and verifiable. This methodical approach further strengthened my resolve and clarified my objectives. As I organized my findings and coordinated with investigators, I reflected on the months of emotional turmoil, the pain, and the constant fear. The undulation of emotions, shock, doubt, betrayal. Fear had been exhausting, but it had prepared me to act decisively. The clarity I now possessed, supported by formal military and legal mechanisms, gave me a sense of control I had not felt in years. My stepfather's reach was extensive, but so was the network of accountability within the military. I drew strength from this, knowing that I had allies' protection and the means to ensure justice. Emotional waves continued, but they were now tempered by strategy and resolve. I knew that confronting him, exposing the evidence, and seeing justice done would require careful coordination, patience, and courage. Yet the fear that had once dominated my thoughts was now joined by a fierce determination, a sense of empowerment that I had earned through months of preparation, documentation, and strategic planning. I began to envision the steps that would lead to a public exposure, the necessary involvement of military command, and the eventual consequences for my stepfather. The fear of retaliation still lingered, but it was balanced by the knowledge that the evidence was irrefutable and that the investigation was underway. I had moved from helplessness to strategy, from uncertainty to empowerment. The shift was palpable. I could feel the weight of months of manipulation lifting as I embraced the tools, resources, and authority available to me. The first stage of reclaiming my autonomy was complete. The next would be execution, carefully planned, measured, and deliberate. I was no longer a victim. I was an empowered captain ready to confront the manipulation, expose the deception, and ensure accountability. Every step I had taken, every screenshot, every backup, every discussion with JAG and medical authorities brought me closer to justice. The emotional undulation of fear, betrayal, and anger had transformed into clarity, resolve, and empowerment. I felt prepared for the confrontation ahead, and I knew that the path I had chosen, while difficult and emotionally taxing, would ultimately restore control, dignity, and justice. After weeks of gathering evidence, consulting with JAG officers, and coordinating with military medical authorities, I knew it was time to plan the next stage, the public exposure of my stepfather. I had painstakingly documented every interference, every manipulated record, every act of control, and now I had to turn those files into a strategic presentation that would leave no room for doubt. I sat in my Fort Bragg quarters late at night with the folders spread around me. Photographs of annotated logs, screenshots of emails, and printed reports from both Army gynecologists stacked meticulously in piles. My heart pounded a mixture of adrenaline fear and determination. The stakes were high. This was not just about my own health. It was about holding someone accountable who had abused authority trust and access to manipulate my body and career for years. The planning had to be precise. I could not allow any misstep that would give him an opportunity to deny or undermine the truth. I began outlining the sequence of the exposure, the location, timing, audience, and presentation. I decided the ideal place would be a formal assembly hall on base, where key officers, medical personnel, and select colleagues could witness the evidence firsthand. It needed to be controlled yet public enough to ensure that there could be no manipulation or suppression of the facts. I spent hours rehearsing the flow in my mind. Each piece of evidence would be introduced methodically, first establishing the context of my service, my health concerns, and then presenting the documented interference by him. I planned the order carefully. Start with medical evidence, move to communications and logs showing deliberate manipulation, and conclude with the impact on my career and autonomy. Every slide, every document, every spoken word was imagined, rehearsed, and refined in my head. The tension was palpable. I knew my stepfather had no idea I had uncovered the full extent of his actions. He still believed he controlled the narrative, that I was unaware that I would continue to follow his direction silently. The thought of the moment when he realized he had been discovered sent a shiver through me. Anticipation mingled with fear as I imagined him seated among the audience, confronted with irrefutable evidence of his manipulations. I had to remain calm, collected, and commanding. The persona I had developed as a captain would serve me well. I drafted notes, rehearsed statements, and envisioned my demeanor emphasizing clarity, authority, and composure. The emotional undulation within me was intense. Fear surged when I imagined potential retaliation. Anger flared at the months of betrayal, and manipulation and determination solidified into a sharp edge that focused every thought and action. I coordinated with JAG officers to ensure that the legal presentation was airtight. They reviewed the documentation, suggested ways to frame questions, and helped me understand what could be admissible or challenged. Their guidance was invaluable, giving me confidence that the exposure would be both credible and unassailable. I also worked closely with the Army gynecologists who had examined me, ensuring that they would provide clear, factual testimony regarding the abnormalities, the manipulation, and the risks that had been posed by the stepfather's interference. This collaboration reinforced the weight of the evidence and gave me the reassurance that the truth could not be denied. I created multiple contingencies for the event. What if he reacted violently? What if he attempted to distract, discredit, or intimidate me? I planned my responses, rehearsed my posture, and ensured that allies and authorities were present to intervene if necessary. The level of preparation required focus and emotional resilience. Even in the quiet of my quarters, I could feel the tension rising, the anxiety that had been simmering for months coalescing into a sharp, focused energy. The anticipation of the moment was almost unbearable. I visualized him realizing in real time that the control he had exercised for so long had been exposed, that his manipulation and interference would no longer be hidden. I imagined the gasps, the murmurs, and the weight of truth settling over the audience as the evidence was laid bare. My planning extended beyond the presentation itself. I considered the follow-up, the documentation of reactions, the steps to ensure formal accountability, and the measures necessary to protect myself and maintain credibility. The meticulous nature of the planning mirrored my approach to military operations. Every detail mattered. Timing, sequencing, presentation, and clarity of evidence were paramount. The suspense built naturally as I anticipated the first moments of the exposure. The sharp intake of breath, the recognition of betrayal, and the irreversible shift in power. I rehearsed my statements repeatedly, speaking them aloud in the empty room, refining tone, emphasis, and pacing. I knew that composure and strategic delivery would amplify the impact of the evidence, ensuring that my stepfather could not deflect or manipulate perception in the moment. I also prepared for the emotional impact on myself. Confronting a person who had undermined my health and career for years would be difficult, yet I needed to remain centered, controlled, and authoritative. My mental preparation was as critical as the logistical planning of the event. As I finalized the agenda, I reflected on the months of fear, fatigue, and betrayal. Every moment of uncertainty, every pang of doubt, every encounter with my stepfather's controlling presence had led to this moment. The careful documentation, the corroborating medical evidence, and the coordination with legal and military authorities had shifted the balance. I was no longer a passive participant. I was in command of the situation, ready to deliver justice strategically and publicly. I felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as I imagined the first moments of the exposure, the reactions of those in attendance, and the inevitable realization by my stepfather that his manipulation could no longer continue. The emotional undulation was intense. Fear, anger, determination, and cautious satisfaction intermingled, heightening both tension and focus. I rehearsed the delivery of critical lines, emphasizing clarity, authority, and calm composure. Every piece of evidence, every statement, and every movement was planned to maximize impact while maintaining credibility and control. The suspense was unbearable, yet exhilarating. I could feel the weight of months of hidden betrayal lifting as I mentally traced the sequence of the exposure, the culmination of strategic planning, evidence, and preparation. The anticipation was like a taut wire, every thought focused, every detail considered, every eventuality accounted for. I reminded myself that this was not about vengeance in the personal sense, but about accountability, justice, and reclaiming control over my life and career. The preparation gave me clarity and purpose. By the time the day of the exposure arrived, I felt a strange calm in the eye of the storm. I was ready. I had anticipated every potential response, coordinated with allies and authorities, and ensured that the evidence was compelling, organized, and irrefutable. My stepfather had no idea I had uncovered the truth, and no idea that the web of manipulation he had created would be undone in a single decisive public moment. I allowed myself a brief, steadying breath, reminding myself that months of meticulous planning had brought me to this point. The public exposure was no longer a hypothetical scenario. It was imminent. The suspense, the fear, the anger, and the anticipation coalesced into a focused resolve. I would reveal the truth, protect my autonomy, and ensure that justice was served. The stage was set, the audience assembled, and I was ready to confront the culmination of years of control and manipulation. The moment would be unforgettable. Every step of planning, every hour of documentation, and every strategic decision had led to this. The public exposure was not just necessary, it was inevitable, and I was prepared to execute it flawlessly. The morning of the exposure, I woke with a mixture of dread, adrenaline, and grim determination. Months of investigation, countless hours of documentation, and meticulous planning had led to this moment. Fort Bragg's main assembly hall was buzzing with activity as officers, medical personnel, and selected colleagues began to fill the seats. The room was formal, the air crisp with the discipline of military precision, but for me it carried an almost electric tension every step toward the hall, magnifying the weight of what was about to unfold. I carried a single briefcase containing the culmination of my evidence, medical records, screenshots, annotated logs, and printouts of communications. Each document was a weapon of truth, carefully organized to ensure that the narrative of manipulation and betrayal would be irrefutable. I walked down the corridor past fellow service members who were oblivious to the storm about to erupt. My pulse thumped in my ears as I considered the man who would soon enter that room unawares. My stepfather. The man who had undermined my health, controlled my medical records, and subtly sabotaged my career. The one I had once trusted completely. He had no idea I had uncovered everything. The thought of the shock on his face as he realized that the truth was about to be laid bare sent a shiver down my spine. I entered the hall moments before the session began, scanning the audience. Key officers from the medical command, my unit supervisors, and military legal advisors were present. The gravity of their presence heightened the stakes. The room was hushed, conversations halting as the session began. I was introduced to the assembly, formally asked to present my findings, and I took the podium with my shoulders squared and my mind laser-focused. My stepfather entered the hall a few minutes later. He walked in with the composure he always displayed, a practiced smile, oblivious to the storm approaching. I felt a surge of controlled fury. The moment had arrived. I began with context, calmly detailing my service record, my dedication to the Army, and the physical and mental challenges I had faced over the years. I wanted the audience to understand the reliability, discipline, and trustworthiness I had earned, qualities my stepfather had exploited and manipulated. I carefully introduced the initial medical findings from Fort Bragg, describing the abnormalities detected during routine examinations and follow-up tests. I paused strategically, allowing the weight of the information to settle over the audience. Gasps echoed softly, officers exchanging glances as they registered the seriousness of the situation. The first whispers of concern reached the back of the hall. I continued presenting the independent confirmation from Camp Lejeune, emphasizing the professional credibility of the second opinion. I laid out the timeline of symptoms, the delays, and the subtle interference documented over months. The audience leaned in the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Then I presented the evidence of direct interference annotations in his personal logs, altered medical records, intercepted communications, and manipulated appointments. Each item was displayed with care and clarity, leaving no ambiguity. I observed my stepfather for the first time in this setting. His practiced composure faltered almost imperceptibly at first, then noticeably. His eyes darted between the documents, the audience, and me. I could see a flicker of realization followed by a tightening of his jaw, the color draining slightly from his face. The shock was evident. The mask of control he had worn for years was beginning to crack. I described the implications of his actions, the jeopardy to my health, the interference with my career, the manipulation of medical professionals, and the abuse of authority and trust. The room was silent, the weight of each word settling on officers and colleagues alike. I paused to let the gravity of the situation register. Murmurs rippled across the audience, but all eyes remained focused on the unfolding revelations. The emotional undulation I had experienced privately, the shock, disbelief, anger, and determination was now mirrored in the audience. Faces reflected surprise, confusion, and the growing sense of outrage. I could feel a powerful wave of catharsis building within me as the room absorbed the truth. My stepfather attempted to interject. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain control and challenge my assertions. "Lillian, you're misrepresenting facts. You are exaggerating and twisting my actions," he said, his voice shaky despite the effort to sound authoritative. I did not flinch. I held up a folder, carefully guiding the audience's attention to the documents. "These are your own words, your own annotations, your own directives. There is no exaggeration. Every action you took is documented, and the consequences are clear. You interfered with my health and career intentionally." The shock on his face was unmistakable. The audience reacted audibly, this time, gasps, murmurs, and expressions of disbelief. My stepfather's body language shifted from defensive to flustered as he realized the extent of exposure. I walked through the sequence, connecting each act of interference with its direct impact on my physical well-being and career trajectory. Officers whispered among themselves, nodding and taking notes, the weight of the evidence leaving them no room for doubt. The emotional tension was at its peak. I could see members of the medical command leaning forward, fully engaged, as the strategic and methodical unfolding of the evidence left no gaps. My stepfather stammered, trying to regain composure, his face pale and strained. I paused intentionally, letting silence amplify the gravity of the moment. Then I addressed the core of the betrayal, the abuse of trust authority, and the manipulation of someone who had served faithfully and relied on him. "This is not a matter of opinion. This is a matter of documented, deliberate actions. You used your access, your authority, and your position to harm me. And now the truth is before everyone." The room was electrified. The collective shock of the audience combined with my own emotional catharsis. I felt years of fear suppression and manipulation being lifted with every glance of disbelief at my stepfather, every acknowledgement of outrage in the faces around me. Officers began to ask questions, seeking clarification, and I provided direct factual responses referring to the documented evidence. My stepfather was visibly shaking, attempting to assert control, but failing the weight of exposure, leaving him powerless. I observed a mixture of horror, shame, and fear pass over his face, the mask of authority, dominance, and control utterly stripped away. I could feel the tide turning completely. The audience, composed of peers, superiors, and medical professionals, now understood the depth of manipulation and abuse. The shock and outrage were palpable. The catharsis I felt, the release of months of tension, fear, and anger, was mirrored by those around me. I had reclaimed my voice, my authority, and my power. Finally, I paused and looked directly at him, letting the silence speak. "Would you stand up if someone betrayed you like this?" I asked, my tone calm yet sharp. The room echoed with the weight of the question. My stepfather had nothing left to say. The presentation was over, the evidence undeniable. The audience absorbed every detail, the impact of exposure complete. I stepped down from the podium with a quiet sense of triumph, not in vengeance, but in reclaiming autonomy and ensuring accountability. Every fear, every doubt, every moment of anxiety that had plagued me had led to this moment of empowerment. The stepfather who had manipulated, controlled, and endangered me was now exposed to the people who mattered, those who could ensure consequences, oversight, and justice. I walked from the podium with my head held high, the energy in the hall charged with shock, outrage, and a shared sense of justice. The catharsis was complete for me and for those who had silently observed the subtle manipulations over time. In that moment, I felt the full weight and the full relief of exposure. I had reclaimed my narrative, my authority, and my life. The storm of fear, betrayal, and uncertainty had transformed into clarity, empowerment, and an undeniable assertion of justice. The aftermath of the public exposure left the assembly hall in stunned silence. Officers and medical personnel were slowly processing the gravity of what they had witnessed. I had presented the evidence meticulously, leaving no room for doubt, and my stepfather sat there pale, disoriented, and stripped of every pretense he had cultivated for decades. I left the podium, walking down the center aisle with my chest taut, my heart still thrumming with adrenaline. I knew that the confrontation was not yet over. As the crowd dispersed, I saw him gathering his composure, or at least attempting to. His eyes locked on mine, and in that instant I recognized a familiar mixture of fear, disbelief, and audacity. He approached cautiously, his movements calculated, but the desperation in his gaze betrayed him. "Lillian," he began, his voice trembling. "Please, we can fix this. I never meant for any of this to go this far. Let me help. I can make it right. I will cooperate fully. You have to believe me, I'm sorry, and I will do whatever it takes to repair this." His words were a mixture of pleading and attempted authority, a familiar dance of control and manipulation. I stopped walking and turned to face him, fully letting the silence stretch. I felt the weight of months of betrayal, manipulation, and intimidation pressing down on me. The audacity of his return after everything I had exposed was almost laughable if it weren't so chilling. I remained calm, my body poised, my eyes steady. Help, repair. After years of controlling my health, manipulating my records, undermining my career, and endangering me, I spoke deliberately, each word slicing through the tension in the room. Do not pretend that a few words of apology can erase the deliberate harm you have caused. Do not presume that I would ever allow you the opportunity to continue influencing my life in any way. He took a step closer, as if proximity could reassert dominance, but I did not flinch. "Lillian, please. Think about what you're saying. I can make amends. We can work together. I will fix this for your health, for your career, for the reputation of this family." I shook my head slowly, my voice firm and cold. "Amends, fix, you have no concept of what you have destroyed. There is nothing to fix that does not involve accountability, consequences, and transparency. Your era of control ends here. You are not negotiating forgiveness or a second chance. The only path you can take now is to face the consequences of your actions under law and military protocol." The audacity of his return, the attempt to manipulate, to charm, to coerce, was entirely predictable, yet it only reinforced my resolve. He had been confident for years, expecting compliance, silence, or fear to keep me under control, but he had underestimated my preparation, my courage, and my determination. Every inch of his calculated facade was crumbling in the presence of truth and accountability. He seemed flustered, his voice rising in frustration and panic. "You don't understand. This can ruin both of us. Think of the repercussions. If this goes any further—" I interrupted my tone, cutting deliberate and cold. "I understand completely. That is precisely the point. The repercussions must be real, measurable, and unavoidable. You cannot intimidate, manipulate, or evade the consequences of deliberately endangering my health, interfering with my medical care, and attempting to sabotage my career. There is no leniency here, no negotiation. Your actions have been documented, verified, and presented. Justice will take its course, and I will ensure that it does." I could see the moment of realization in his eyes, a flicker of fear that he had never allowed himself to feel. The room seemed to shrink, his attempts at dominance nullified by the weight of irrefutable evidence, witness testimony, and the attention of the military and medical authorities present. "Lillian, please, he stammered, but I raised my hand to stop him, signaling that the conversation was over. "No, you will not speak further. Any cooperation from this point will be handled through legal and military channels. You will face accountability, and I will not intervene to soften the consequences." His shoulders slumped, and I saw the deflation of the man who had always relied on fear, manipulation, and control. The audacity to return to try to claim authority or forgiveness had been met with cold, unyielding resolve. He realized that there was no path back to power, no opportunity to rewrite history, no chance to reclaim influence. I turned away from him and addressed the attending officers and legal advisors. "This is not personal," I said. "It is about accountability, transparency, and the safety and integrity of our service members. He will answer for every deliberate action he took to undermine those principles." The room was silent, the tension palpable. My stepfather remained standing, watching powerless while the weight of exposure pressed upon him from all sides. I could feel the satisfaction of long-delayed justice mingled with a cold sense of finality. He had gambled on manipulation and deception for years, and now he faced the consequences without recourse. Over the following hours, the legal and military personnel began formal proceedings documenting his conduct, reviewing evidence, and confirming the chain of events I had meticulously presented. I observed as his face went from shock to fear to resignation. There was no charm, no threat, no manipulation left, only accountability. The catharsis was almost overwhelming. Every effort, every hour of planning, every document and note I had painstakingly gathered had brought me to this moment. I had reclaimed control and ensured that the consequences were real, undeniable, and enforceable. Over the next several days, formal military actions were initiated. My stepfather was suspended from all duties pending investigation, restricted from accessing any military systems, and officially reprimanded for conduct unbecoming an authority figure and for interference with a service member's health and career. The legal process also moved forward. Evidence was submitted to military prosecutors who confirmed violations of policy, abuse of authority, and endangerment of a subordinate. Every sanction, restriction, and review was a direct consequence of the exposure I had orchestrated, supported by irrefutable evidence. I felt a complex wave of emotions, relief, validation, and a quiet sense of satisfaction tempered by the years of betrayal and manipulation I had endured. I had not only confronted the audacity of his attempted plea and manipulation, but had seen it fail spectacularly. My stepfather's attempt to regain control, to secure forgiveness, or to manipulate the process was met with unwavering resolve. I had asserted authority, presented truth, and enforced accountability. The empowerment I felt was profound. Months of fear, manipulation, and subtle coercion had culminated in a moment of undeniable justice. I had taken the first step in reclaiming my life and autonomy, and I had done so with strategy, courage, and precision. There was no satisfaction in revenge alone, but in seeing that deliberate manipulation and abuse of trust would no longer succeed, that the consequences were real and immediate. I walked away from him with my head high, each step reinforcing the reclaiming of my autonomy and authority. The lessons of the past, the months of preparation, and the careful orchestration of the exposure had brought clarity, control, and empowerment. He had returned audaciously seeking forgiveness and mitigation, but I had delivered clarity, accountability, and a message that manipulation and abuse of trust would meet inevitable consequences. The finality of that moment, the complete failure of his attempt to regain power, left me with a deep sense of satisfaction and emotional closure. I knew the path forward involved continued monitoring of the formal proceedings, coordination with military authorities, and ensuring that all evidence remained secure, but the first and most crucial step had been taken. I had faced the audacity of his attempted manipulation head-on and emerged not only unscathed but strengthened. Justice was underway, and I had taken an active, deliberate role in ensuring it. The weeks following the public exposure were intense. Military investigators, legal officers, and medical authorities coordinated to ensure that my stepfather faced the consequences of his actions. Every piece of evidence I had collected, every annotated log, every email, every medical record had been scrutinized and validated. The process was thorough, exacting, and relentless, but I knew that this was necessary to guarantee accountability. I attended the proceedings with a sense of calm purpose, my heart steady despite the gravity of what was unfolding. The hearings confirmed the extent of his interference. Deliberate manipulation of my health records, interference with medical procedures, obstruction of independent evaluations, and covert attempts to undermine my military career. Each revelation was met with a mixture of shock and disbelief from the panel, who had not fully realized the extent of his manipulations until the evidence was presented systematically. The emotional undulation I experienced was profound. Fear had given way to empowerment during the exposure, and now, as I watched the formal process unfold, a deep satisfaction began to take root. The officers in charge of military oversight meticulously documented every violation, noting that his actions had compromised both my well-being and the integrity of military medical operations. Sanctions were severe. He was immediately relieved of all authority, barred from accessing any military records, and removed from all positions of influence. Administrative penalties were applied, and a formal reprimand became part of his permanent record. These measures were not symbolic. They were designed to ensure that he could never again exercise the control he had so meticulously maintained over me and potentially over others. Simultaneously, the military's legal channels prepared charges for abuse of authority, endangerment of a subordinate, and violations of military medical protocol. Each day as the proceedings progressed, I felt a sense of clarity and finality. The man who had seemed invincible, who had exercised power and manipulation unchecked for years, was now powerless. He had attempted to regain influence audaciously, but each effort had been met with unyielding resolve, leaving him to face the unalterable consequences of his actions. Throughout this time, I focused on my own recovery. Physically, I had endured months of unexplained pain, fatigue, and anxiety, and the confirmation of deliberate interference had intensified the emotional toll. I returned to medical care with renewed diligence, following up with Army gynecologists and specialists to ensure that my health was fully restored. The support of the medical team, who had validated my concerns and stood as impartial witnesses to my ordeal, was invaluable. Gradually, my body regained strength, my energy returned, and the lingering pain began to subside. Emotionally, the journey was more complex. The betrayal by my stepfather had been profound, and the manipulations had affected my trust, my confidence, and my sense of security. Yet witnessing the mechanisms of justice operate effectively, observing the enforcement of consequences, and understanding that I had played an active role in reclaiming my autonomy generated a sense of closure that was both powerful and deeply satisfying. I began to re-engage with my military career, focusing on duties, leadership, and professional responsibilities that had been overshadowed by months of interference and manipulation. I found that each successful task, each positive interaction with colleagues, and each acknowledgement of my competence restored a sense of agency that had been eroded. The process of rebuilding my career was deliberate and measured, akin to rehabilitation after a complex operation. My colleagues, once aware of the situation, offered support, guidance, and affirmation, reinforcing the reality that I had not been isolated in my experience. Their trust, encouragement, and recognition of my professionalism bolstered my emotional resilience. Witnessing my stepfather face consequences, formal reprimands, loss of authority, and potential legal sanctions provided a tangible measure of justice. It was not vindictive satisfaction, but a recognition that systems of accountability were effective when supported by evidence, courage, and strategic action. I allowed myself to reflect on the emotional journey, the fear, the doubt, the betrayal, the empowerment, and now the satisfaction of seeing tangible repercussions. The arc from helplessness to strategic action to accountability had been arduous yet transformative. I felt a renewed sense of purpose and clarity regarding my values, boundaries, and autonomy. Each document I had gathered, each step I had planned had contributed to a restoration not only of justice, but also of self-respect and personal sovereignty. My stepfather's fall from perceived power to enforced accountability underscored the principle that abuse of trust and authority carries consequences. The validation from military authorities, the legal documentation, and the removal of his control reinforced the truth that strategic, courageous action could overcome systemic manipulation. As the hearings concluded and the final administrative actions were enforced, I experienced a deep sense of catharsis. The months of fear and anticipation transformed into clarity and calm. I realized that the journey had not only restored my professional integrity and autonomy, but had also provided a template for reclaiming agency in personal and professional spheres. I focused on reintegration into daily life, balancing military responsibilities with personal recovery. The emotional high from witnessing the mechanisms of justice operate effectively was profound, reinforcing the importance of diligence documentation and courage in confronting abuse. I also began reflecting on the broader implications, the critical importance of vigilance in institutional contexts, the value of corroborated evidence, and the necessity of assertive action in the face of systemic manipulation. These lessons extended beyond my personal experience, providing a framework for understanding accountability, resilience, and empowerment. Gradually, I regained confidence not only in my professional abilities, but in my capacity to protect my personal and professional boundaries. Each day reinforced the notion that empowerment, strategic thinking, and courage could overcome even prolonged manipulation. As I stood once more in uniform, overseeing responsibilities with renewed focus, I felt a profound sense of closure. The threat posed by my stepfather had been neutralized through a combination of evidence, strategic planning, and the proper functioning of institutional justice. The personal and professional restoration was tangible. My body was recovering, my career trajectory was reestablished, and my autonomy was secure. The emotional undulation that had characterized the past months, fear, shock, outrage, empowerment, culminated in a powerful sense of satisfaction and closure. The satisfaction did not stem solely from retribution, but from the restoration of order, accountability, and personal sovereignty. Witnessing the consequences my stepfather faced provided a visible and undeniable affirmation that manipulation and abuse of trust could not persist unchallenged. In that moment, I recognized the arc of the journey from hidden suffering to strategic action, from exposure to accountability, and finally from fear and manipulation to empowerment and justice. The room of proceedings, the scrutiny of military and legal authorities, and the enforcement of consequences crystallized a sense of closure that had been absent for years. My stepfather had lost the authority he once wielded, and I had reclaimed the life, career, and health that had been compromised. The shock, the outrage, and the eventual catharsis had created a narrative of accountability that was both instructive and emotionally resonant. I could finally breathe knowing that my strategic, deliberate, and courageous actions had ensured justice, restored integrity, and reaffirmed the principle that no one could wield power through manipulation and deceit without facing the consequences. The weeks following the official repercussions for my stepfather were some of the most surreal of my life. For the first time in years, I was able to breathe without that constant, suffocating tension pressing down on me. My mornings began not with the anxiety of anticipating his interference, but with the deliberate, calm rhythm of my own choosing. I returned to my quarters at Fort Bragg each day and allowed myself to reflect on the extraordinary journey I had endured, months of manipulation, covert control, and the subtle but persistent erosion of my autonomy. The emotional undulation of those past months had left its mark. Fear, disbelief, anger, betrayal, and eventually determination had shaped me in ways I could scarcely have imagined. Now, as I stepped back and examined the trajectory, I could appreciate not only the hardships I had endured, but also the empowerment I had gained through facing them directly. Physically, my health was steadily improving. I continued regular checkups with the Army gynecologists who had supported me throughout this ordeal. Each appointment was a reminder that my body, once compromised by interference and neglect, was resilient and capable of recovery. The lingering fatigue and abdominal pain that had plagued me for months gradually faded, replaced by strength and confidence. I marveled at the capacity of the human body to heal when given proper care and attention, and I was grateful that I had taken control of my medical autonomy before irreversible damage occurred. Professionally, my reputation within the Army was being restored and perhaps strengthened by the transparency and courage I had demonstrated. Colleagues who had once been distant or neutral began to approach me with support, admiration, and genuine concern. The very people who had seen me as a subordinate in my unit now regarded me with respect, recognizing both my competence and my fortitude in navigating a complex, high-stakes personal crisis without compromising my professional responsibilities. I reflected on the contrast between the fear I had felt under my stepfather's control and the sense of empowerment I now experienced. The months of manipulation had attempted to condition me to doubt my instincts, question my capabilities, and defer to his authority in both personal and professional matters. Yet through careful evidence-gathering, strategic action, and unwavering resolve, I had reclaimed that power and proved to myself and to others that control over one's life and choices is not to be surrendered lightly. This reflection brought a profound sense of peace, a stillness in which I could process both the betrayal and the triumph that followed. I allowed myself to revisit the darker periods with clarity and perspective. I remembered the subtle ways he had exerted control, the insidious comments about my fitness and competence, the clandestine monitoring of appointments, the rewriting of records to delay or obscure medical findings. The emotional impact of recognizing these patterns was significant, but I no longer felt paralyzed by fear or resentment. Instead, I felt a renewed sense of agency and confidence. I also considered the broader implications of my experience. Abuse and control can manifest subtly, particularly when wielded by someone with authority or trusted access. Awareness, documentation, and strategic action are critical in confronting such abuse. I took pride in my methodical approach, understanding that courage alone is insufficient. Preparation, evidence, and deliberate planning are essential components of achieving accountability and justice. As I navigated these reflections, I also focused on the personal growth that had emerged from adversity. The experience had reinforced my resilience, sharpened my strategic thinking, and solidified my self-reliance. I had learned to trust my instincts, recognize red flags, and act decisively when confronted with manipulation or abuse. This empowerment extended beyond professional boundaries. It influenced my interactions, my decision-making, and my approach to challenges in every aspect of life. I began to incorporate structured routines into my daily life, balancing military duties with personal wellness practices. Meditation exercise and journaling became tools to maintain clarity, emotional balance, and resilience. These practices allowed me to process past trauma, reinforce my autonomy, and cultivate a sense of peace that had been absent for far too long. Slowly, the psychological weight of the betrayal lifted, replaced by confidence in my ability to navigate both personal and professional spheres. I reflected on the courage it had taken to move from fear to action. Each step gathering evidence, coordinating with JAG officers, consulting independent medical professionals, and executing the public exposure had been a deliberate assertion of agency. The emotional undulation of shock, doubt, and betrayal had been intense, yet it had forged a strength and clarity I had not known before. I recognized that my healing was ongoing, but that it was grounded in empowerment rather than reaction or revenge. I took time to reconnect with colleagues and mentors who had supported me indirectly throughout the ordeal. Their validation and encouragement reinforced my confidence and reminded me that solidarity and accountability are powerful forces in confronting abuse. These interactions contributed to a sense of community and support, highlighting the importance of both personal resilience and collective vigilance. I also reflected on the personal boundaries I had reclaimed. For years, my stepfather had attempted to manipulate not only my health, but also my perceptions, decisions, and autonomy. By confronting him and ensuring accountability, I had reasserted my right to self-determination, professional integrity, and bodily autonomy. This realization brought a profound sense of peace and closure. Emotionally, I oscillated between gratitude relief and a lingering awareness of vulnerability. The empowerment I had achieved did not erase the trauma, but it provided the tools and clarity to navigate its aftermath constructively. I had transformed fear and betrayal into strategic action and agency, and that transformation was central to my ongoing healing. Physically and mentally, I began to experience a restored sense of equilibrium. The lingering fatigue, anxiety, and hypervigilance diminished as I integrated structured routines, supportive networks, and deliberate reflection into my life. Each day reinforced the reality that empowerment and peace are achievable even after prolonged manipulation and abuse. I also revisited the narrative of my military service with renewed clarity. The dedication, discipline, and resilience that had defined my career were reaffirmed through my ability to navigate this complex personal crisis without compromising professional responsibilities. The congruence between personal agency and professional integrity provided a sense of fulfillment and closure that had been absent during the months of interference. Looking back, I could see the trajectory of the past year. The initial fear, the subtle manipulations, the shock of discovery, the strategic planning, the exposure, the consequences for my stepfather, and finally the restoration of autonomy and integrity. The emotional arc from fear through empowerment to peace was a testament to the resilience, courage, and clarity that had guided me throughout the ordeal. I allowed myself a moment to acknowledge the significance of this journey. The trauma of manipulation and abuse had been real and impactful. Yet, the deliberate, calculated actions I had taken to reclaim control had transformed that experience into a powerful narrative of empowerment and justice. I felt a deep sense of calm, a quiet pride in the strategies, decisions, and actions that had led to this state of equilibrium. The emotional undulation of shock, fear, and betrayal had been intense, but the ultimate outcome, empowerment, accountability, and personal peace, was profoundly satisfying. I understood that the journey was ongoing, that vigilance and self-care remained necessary, but the foundations of autonomy, integrity, and empowerment had been firmly re-established. The days following the formal repercussions for my stepfather were not only about processing what had happened, but also about rebuilding the network of trust that his manipulations had eroded. For years, I had felt isolated, doubting whether anyone in my professional or personal circles could be relied upon. The realization of his betrayal had been suffocating, but as the formal military and legal proceedings advanced, an unexpected but deeply welcome pattern began to emerge. Allies I had not anticipated. It began with small gestures. A fellow captain in my unit approached me in the hallway with a quiet nod of acknowledgement, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of support. "Lillian," she said softly, "I can only imagine what you've been through, but you handled it with integrity. We're here for you." I felt a surge of relief and gratitude. It was a validation of not only my actions but also my resilience. These small acts of acknowledgement grew in frequency and intensity over the next several days. Colleagues from the medical command officers who had witnessed parts of the exposure or had been aware of the investigation began to reach out with messages of support. Some offered mentorship, others simply a listening ear, and a few even extended invitations to discuss professional projects and responsibilities, emphasizing their trust in my judgment and capabilities. I realized gradually that I was not alone. This network of unexpected allies provided a buffer against the residual fear and stress that lingered from months of manipulation. It reinforced the fact that while my stepfather had sought to isolate and control me, there were individuals who could recognize integrity, courage, and professionalism. Among the most unexpected forms of support were the medical personnel who had testified during the exposure. They continued to check in, providing updates on follow-up procedures, offering guidance and validating the ongoing recovery of both my health and my professional credibility. These interactions were grounding, reassuring me that the truth had not only been heard, but also respected and corroborated by experts whose opinions were beyond reproach. One afternoon, I received a call from a senior officer in my unit whom I had not worked closely with before. His tone was warm but formal, the cadence of someone who understood both protocol and empathy. "Captain Cross," he began, "I wanted to personally acknowledge your courage and integrity. The way you handled the investigation, the exposure, and your professionalism throughout has not gone unnoticed. We stand with you, and you can count on our support as you navigate the aftermath." The words, simple though they were, carried a weight I had not anticipated. It was a reminder that in institutions like the military, where hierarchy and protocol often dominate, the value of integrity and courage is recognized and honored. Over the following weeks, I found that I was able to rebuild bridges that had been strained or severed. Officers who had once maintained a neutral stance now offered guidance, feedback, and collaboration. Colleagues in adjacent units reached out offering partnership on projects and even casual invitations to social or professional gatherings. Each gesture was a subtle but profound affirmation of my restored position and credibility. Emotional undulation shifted during this period from the lingering anxiety of betrayal to a sense of positive catharsis. The knowledge that I had acted decisively, strategically, and ethically, combined with the visible support from peers and superiors, fostered a sense of empowerment and emotional resilience. The support network extended beyond professional interactions. A few officers and medical personnel, aware of the personal and psychological toll the past months had taken, offered practical support in the form of wellness resources, counseling recommendations, and informal check-ins. I embraced these opportunities, understanding that recovery was multidimensional, encompassing physical health, professional credibility, and emotional well-being. It was particularly affirming to witness younger colleagues expressing admiration for the integrity, courage, and poise I had displayed. Their recognition was an unexpected but profoundly gratifying reinforcement of the positive impact that strategic ethical action can have not only in achieving justice, but also in inspiring others. These interactions, while initially surprising, became integral to my daily life. I began to rely on the guidance, perspective, and validation offered by this network, realizing that rebuilding trust and professional relationships was as important as securing justice against my stepfather. One evening, during a meeting with a group of medical and military colleagues who had supported me throughout the process, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. We reviewed procedural updates, coordinated future responsibilities, and discussed wellness initiatives. The atmosphere was collegial yet purposeful, a stark contrast to the tension and isolation of the past months. I was reminded that while my stepfather had attempted to dominate and isolate me, there existed a broader community committed to integrity, transparency, and accountability. This realization brought a profound emotional release. I allowed myself to acknowledge the relief, the sense of being understood, and the positive affirmation that had been absent during the months of manipulation. It was a moment of genuine catharsis, reinforced by tangible support and recognition. The experience also highlighted the importance of alliances built on trust, mutual respect, and shared values. These unexpected allies demonstrated that the consequences of integrity and courage extend beyond personal vindication. They cultivate environments where accountability is reinforced, where manipulation cannot thrive unchecked, and where support structures are available for those who act with principled determination. I began to integrate this network into my daily routines, seeking advice, sharing perspectives, and collaborating on initiatives that enhanced both professional effectiveness and personal resilience. The ongoing interactions served to reinforce my confidence, providing a buffer against any lingering anxiety or uncertainty. Over time, I noticed a shift in my internal dialogue. The fear, doubt, and anxiety that had characterized the months of manipulation gave way to a steady sense of empowerment and self-assurance. I recognized that the strategic actions I had taken were effective not only in ensuring justice, but also in creating a support system that could sustain my professional and emotional well-being. My stepfather's absence of influence and the visible support from colleagues combined to create a secure foundation for continued professional success and personal recovery. In private moments, I reflected on the contrast between the isolation imposed by manipulation and the reassurance provided by these unexpected allies. The emotional undulation of shock, betrayal, and fear had now been replaced by empowerment, validation, and a sense of community. This reinforced the principle that courage, strategic planning, and ethical action can attract support, restore credibility, and foster resilience in the face of prior adversity. I also began mentoring younger officers who had witnessed parts of the exposure and investigation. Sharing insights about resilience documentation and ethical decision-making allowed me to contribute positively to the development of a culture grounded in integrity. The act of guiding others further reinforced my sense of agency and purpose. Each day, I felt the cumulative effect of these positive interactions. The alliances I had forged provided tangible reassurance and emotional validation, strengthening my sense of autonomy and reinforcing the lessons learned from months of adversity. I no longer felt isolated or powerless. The network of support created a buffer against potential threats, fostered professional collaboration, and reinforced my personal and professional values. Looking back, I understood that these unexpected allies had played a crucial role in both my recovery and the consolidation of justice. Their support, recognition, and collaboration transformed what could have been a solitary and traumatic journey into one reinforced by community validation and shared principles. The emotional catharsis was profound. Fear had given way to empowerment, isolation had given way to collaboration, and betrayal had given way to recognition and support. I had not only achieved justice, but had experienced the restorative power of alliances grounded in integrity and shared purpose. In that moment, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of relief, gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I was no longer alone, that my actions had inspired respect, and that the consequences for my stepfather were not only personal but reinforced by an entire network of principled, supportive colleagues. The process of closing the loop was as much mental as it was procedural. After the public exposure, the legal actions, and the formal reprimands, I realized that while immediate consequences had been enforced, there remained the need to ensure that my stepfather would never again wield influence over me, my career, or my health. I returned to my quarters at Fort Bragg with a sense of determination and clarity. Every document, email, and medical record that I had meticulously gathered over months needed to be reviewed, cross-referenced, and consolidated into a final comprehensive dossier. This dossier would serve not only as a record of past events, but also as a safeguard against any potential future attempts to interfere or manipulate. I laid out the materials carefully on my desk, organizing them chronologically, highlighting connections between manipulated records, suspicious communications, and documented health impacts. The process was painstaking. Each annotation reminded me of the months of anxiety, fear, and uncertainty I had endured. Yet with each review, a sense of empowerment grew. I was taking the final steps in reclaiming control over my life. I cross-checked the access logs from military medical databases, confirming that all permissions previously held by my stepfather had been revoked. There was no longer any possibility for him to alter, withhold, or manipulate information. The realization that the mechanisms of his influence had been dismantled provided a profound emotional relief. I could finally begin to trust in the security of my personal and professional information. My next step was to coordinate with my attorney and military legal advisors to ensure that all actions taken were formally documented and that the process of accountability was permanent. We reviewed every procedural note, every official communication, and every piece of evidence that had been presented during hearings. This review confirmed that my stepfather's authority had been nullified, his ability to interfere permanently restricted, and his access to sensitive systems removed. The knowledge that these safeguards were in place provided a profound sense of closure. Yet I also knew that vigilance was essential. I established a monitoring system collaborating with trusted colleagues and legal advisors to ensure that any future anomalies would be detected immediately. This proactive approach not only reinforced my sense of security, but also demonstrated that empowerment requires ongoing attention and strategic planning. During this period, I reflected deeply on the emotional journey I had undertaken. The months of fear, betrayal, manipulation, and uncertainty had culminated in empowerment, justice, and autonomy. Each step from gathering evidence to orchestrating the public exposure had been deliberate and intentional. I allowed myself to feel pride in my strategic thinking, resilience, and ability to navigate a highly complex and emotionally charged situation. I also spent time considering the broader implications. Abuse of authority, particularly within a hierarchical institution like the military, can have devastating consequences if left unchecked. The experience had reinforced the importance of documentation, strategic action, and leveraging institutional support. I recognized that my meticulous approach had not only safeguarded my career and health, but had also set a precedent for accountability and vigilance. The emotional undulation that had characterized the past months, fear shock, outrage, empowerment, had transformed into a steady, resilient equilibrium. I could feel the tension of past months slowly dissolving, replaced by clarity, confidence, and a sense of personal sovereignty. One afternoon, I met with the legal team and military advisors to review contingency plans for potential appeals or challenges. Although I was confident in the documented evidence and the outcomes achieved, it was essential to ensure that every procedural step was complete and enforceable. The thoroughness of these meetings reinforced my sense of control and preparedness. I realized that closing the loop was not merely about administrative finality, but about emotional and psychological closure as well. Each review, each confirmation of revoked access, and each discussion with trusted advisors strengthened my confidence that I was fully autonomous and that my stepfather's influence had been nullified. The sense of empowerment I experienced was profound. The emotional relief was accompanied by a cautious optimism, a recognition that while past trauma could not be erased, the future was now firmly in my control. I could move forward without fear of interference, manipulation, or coercion. During this process, I also took time to reflect on the lessons learned and the growth achieved. I recognized that resilient strategic thinking and ethical action are inseparable when confronting complex situations involving manipulation and abuse of authority. The meticulous, deliberate steps I had taken had not only ensured justice, but had also reinforced my sense of self and professional integrity. As the final confirmations of accountability were completed, I began to organize a personal debrief documenting every aspect of the experience for my own reference and for the benefit of any colleagues or subordinates who might face similar situations. This debrief was both cathartic and empowering, reinforcing the narrative of empowerment and accountability. I created detailed summaries of each stage of the investigation, exposure, and consequences, highlighting strategic decisions, evidence collected, and interactions with legal and military authorities. The act of synthesizing the experience into a coherent narrative provided a profound sense of closure. I could now see the arc of the entire ordeal, from initial fear and manipulation to strategic action, public exposure, accountability, and ultimately, empowerment and autonomy. The clarity of this narrative reinforced the lessons learned and the strategies that had been effective. I also began mentoring younger officers and colleagues, sharing insights on navigating complex personal and professional challenges within hierarchical institutions. Through these conversations, I found an additional layer of fulfillment, knowing that my experience could serve as both a cautionary tale and a blueprint for resilience and strategic action. I focused on integrating this knowledge into daily practice, emphasizing vigilance, documentation, and ethical decision-making. The act of mentoring reinforced my own empowerment, allowing me to see the positive ripple effects of strategic action, courage, and accountability. Emotionally, I felt a profound sense of relief and closure. The months of fear, manipulation, and uncertainty had been transformed into a narrative of empowerment and justice. The knowledge that my stepfather's ability to interfere had been permanently nullified provided a stable foundation on which to rebuild my personal and professional life. I allowed myself to envision the future with clarity and confidence. I could focus on my career, my health, and my personal well-being without the lingering shadow of his influence. The arc from fear to empowerment to autonomy was complete. The strategic, deliberate, and courageous actions I had taken ensured that the consequences for my stepfather were permanent and that my own life was fully reclaimed. Closing the loop meant not only verifying the removal of influence and control, but also solidifying my own confidence, autonomy, and resilience. It was a moment of profound empowerment and personal clarity. I felt the full weight of relief and satisfaction. The future was now firmly in my control, and the lessons learned from the ordeal would continue to guide my decisions, actions, and professional integrity for years to come. After months of relentless stress, legal battles, and rebuilding my sense of self, I finally felt the subtle yet profound relief of a new beginning. The weight that had hung over me for so long, the fear, the manipulation, the constant second-guessing of every decision was gradually lifting, replaced by a quiet, resolute clarity. I woke one morning in my quarters at Fort Bragg and felt for the first time in years a sense of peace. There was no immediate crisis to anticipate, no covert surveillance to account for, no insidious interference lurking in the shadows of my career. The freedom was almost dizzying, but it was real. I decided it was time to re-engage with life beyond the procedural and tactical to reclaim not only my career, but my personal happiness. I began small walking through the base, greeting colleagues with genuine smiles, enjoying casual conversations without the undercurrent of fear that had so long dominated my interactions. The contrast to the past months was stark. Where there had been apprehension and guardedness, there was now openness and warmth. My relationships at work shifted as well. Many of my colleagues who had been cautiously supportive began to engage more openly, offering advice, companionship, and the occasional invitation to social gatherings. For the first time in a long while, I felt connected, appreciated, and seen, not for the scandal that had embroiled my stepfather, but for the integrity, resilience, and competence I had demonstrated throughout. Among these colleagues, one individual became a steady presence in my life. Lieutenant Marcus Delaney, a fellow Army gynecologist who had supported my testimony during the exposure. He had been professional, empathetic, and remarkably patient during the investigation, always careful to maintain protocol while offering genuine understanding. Over time, our professional interactions grew into something more personal. Shared experiences, long conversations about the challenges of military life, and mutual respect formed a foundation for trust and companionship. I noticed with a mix of surprise and warmth the comfort his presence brought, the feeling of not being alone, of being understood without explanation, and of being respected for my autonomy. One afternoon, after a particularly taxing morning in the medical center, Marcus and I walked along the base's training grounds. The sun cast long golden shadows across the manicured lawns, and for the first time in months, I felt that life could be beautiful again. We spoke candidly about our experiences, the pressures of service, and the emotional toll of the past year. I shared some of the more challenging moments, not in excruciating detail, but enough to convey the weight I had carried and the resilience I had discovered within myself. Marcus listened intently, his eyes reflecting concern and empathy, never judgment. That conversation crystallized the difference between past manipulation and present support. Where my stepfather had sought to control and dominate, Marcus offered partnership, understanding, and respect. Emotional undulation shifted from the residual caution born of betrayal to cautious hope, and then to a tentative, comforting peace. Days turned into weeks, and the routines of my new life began to solidify. I returned to my full responsibilities within the Army Medical Command, engaging with colleagues, mentoring junior officers, and contributing to the ongoing wellness programs for service members. Yet now, every decision was filtered through the lens of autonomy-informed consent and self-assured judgment. There was a profound contrast between the past, where manipulation had left me second-guessing every move, and the present, where strategic action, empowerment, and support allowed me to act with clarity and confidence. I also re-engaged with the small joys of life that had been overshadowed by fear and betrayal. Weekends were spent hiking local trails, taking quiet walks on Fort Bragg's open grounds, or sharing a coffee with Marcus in one of the base's casual lounges. These moments, simple yet profound, were imbued with the richness of regained freedom and the reassurance that I was capable of both resilience and happiness. Our relationship deepened gradually. Marcus never rushed, never attempted to impose, but his presence became a source of grounding trust and emotional safety. I began to allow myself to envision a future where companionship was not a threat or a source of vulnerability, but a source of strength, encouragement, and mutual respect. This emerging relationship was emblematic of the broader theme of my life at this juncture: contrast. The past had been defined by fear, betrayal, and covert manipulation. The present was marked by choice, clarity, and mutual respect. I often reflected on the dichotomy, the stark differences between what had been and what could be. This reflection, while sometimes bittersweet, reinforced the value of resilience, strategic action, and the capacity to reclaim life after trauma. Professionally, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The experience with my stepfather had forced me to develop meticulous documentation habits, heightened strategic thinking, and acute awareness of institutional processes. These skills now enhanced my effectiveness as a medical officer, allowing me to contribute more confidently to patient care administrative processes and mentorship of junior staff. I began organizing workshops on ethical conduct, transparency in medical record keeping, and resilience in the face of manipulation. These initiatives were deeply rewarding, allowing me to transform my personal experience into practical guidance for others, ensuring that the lessons learned were shared and institutionalized. The empowerment extended beyond professional achievements. I reestablished a balance between work, personal care, and social connections. I engaged in physical training with renewed vigor, practiced mindfulness and reflection, and nurtured personal interests that had been neglected during the months of tension and surveillance. Each step reinforced the emotional payoff, the realization that life, though forever shaped by past trauma, could be rebuilt intentionally, consciously, and with joy. One evening, Marcus invited me to a quiet dinner at a small restaurant off base. The lights were soft, the atmosphere welcoming, and for the first time in years, I felt entirely free to relax, to laugh, and to be fully present. Our conversation ranged from professional aspirations to personal dreams, yet it was underscored by a sense of mutual respect and understanding. In that moment, the contrast with the oppressive, manipulative environment of my past was palpable. Where there had been fear, secrecy, and betrayal, there was now openness, trust, and authentic connection. Emotional undulation reached a peak not of adrenaline or shock, but of profound relief, satisfaction, and hope. I recognized that while the past had shaped me, it no longer controlled me. I had navigated betrayal, orchestrated accountability, and reclaimed both autonomy and dignity. The relationship with Marcus was a manifestation of the new equilibrium I had created, a partnership built on transparency, respect, and shared purpose rather than coercion or manipulation. I also began making plans for the future beyond the immediate scope of my recovery and career restoration. I considered opportunities for professional development, personal growth, and deeper engagement with supportive networks both within and outside the military. The awareness that I could chart my own course free from interference or intimidation provided a profound sense of liberation. Looking back on the months of struggle, exposure, and accountability, I marveled at the arc of my journey. The fear, the manipulation, the strategic planning, the exposure, the empowerment, and finally the reclamation of autonomy and happiness all formed a coherent narrative of resilience. The emotional payoff was immense. The stark contrast between past trauma and present empowerment reinforced the value of courage, clarity, and deliberate action. Each day reinforced the lessons of vigilance, autonomy, and the importance of aligning with trustworthy allies. I embraced the understanding that while betrayal could not be erased, the consequences for those who manipulate, control, or harm could be enforced, and that the recovery and reconstruction of life were possible with determination, strategic action, and support. As the weeks passed, I allowed myself to fully enjoy the new normal, peaceful mornings, productive workdays, meaningful interactions, and a relationship that felt both secure and nurturing. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer dictated my present or future. The contrast, the empowerment, and the emotional payoff were undeniable. I had survived, reclaimed my autonomy, and begun a life built on transparency, integrity, and authentic connection. And for the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely happy, genuinely safe, and genuinely in control of my own life. Sitting quietly in my quarters at Fort Bragg, I finally allowed myself the space to reflect on the journey I had endured over the past year. The months of shock, betrayal, strategic action, exposure, and ultimately justice played out in my mind like a film, each scene layered with the intensity of raw emotion and the clarity of lessons hard earned. The very first moments, the routine Army gynecologist checkup, the unexpected news that something was wrong with my body, had been the catalyst for a chain of events that revealed a betrayal I could scarcely have imagined. At the time, fear had gripped me with a physical weight, making it hard to breathe or think clearly. The uncertainty about my health, combined with the creeping suspicion about my stepfather, created a tension that followed me into every interaction, every decision, and every step of my military duties. The initial shock of realizing that the person I had been forced to trust had manipulated my medical records and attempted to interfere with my health and career was almost paralyzing. The betrayal cut deeper because it was not just a personal violation, but a systemic one. He had used access, authority, and trust in ways that threatened my autonomy, my body, and my career. Processing this betrayal required courage I hadn't known I possessed. I recalled the early weeks of fear and doubt, the subtle manipulations that made me question my own instincts, and the careful strategies I had to employ just to preserve evidence and plan exposure. Each moment was a test of both intellect and resilience. The act of gathering evidence was emotionally taxing but empowering. As I meticulously compiled records, emails, and medical notes, I felt the shift from victim to strategist. For the first time, I recognized that empowerment was possible even in the face of systemic manipulation. It required careful planning, unwavering focus, and a willingness to confront fear head-on. The public exposure at Fort Bragg's Assembly Hall marked the apex of that empowerment. Walking to the podium, presenting every piece of evidence, and watching my stepfather's facade crumble in front of officers, colleagues, and military legal authorities was both terrifying and cathartic. I had anticipated shock and outrage from the audience, but nothing could fully prepare me for the visceral sense of justice being realized in real time. The audacity of his attempted plea for forgiveness, the desperate attempts to regain control or mitigate consequences were met with unwavering resolve. The emotional high of that moment was profound, the shock, the outrage, and finally the catharsis as accountability took hold. Yet the journey was not complete with exposure alone. Weeks of legal proceedings, formal reprimands, and administrative enforcement were required to ensure that he could never again wield influence over my life. Watching the systems of accountability operate effectively, seeing him stripped of authority, and knowing that the consequences were both immediate and permanent reinforced the sense of justice. At the same time, I focused on personal recovery, physically, mentally, and professionally. My health stabilized, my career regained its trajectory, and I began rebuilding relationships with colleagues and mentors who had supported me in subtle ways throughout the ordeal. Emotional undulation shifted from fear and outrage to empowerment, and finally, peace. The realization that I had reclaimed autonomy protected my career and ensured my stepfather faced consequences was both validating and liberating. The emergence of unexpected allies amplified this sense of catharsis. Colleagues, military medical staff, and mentors provided not only practical support, but also emotional validation. Their recognition underscored the fact that integrity, courage, and strategic action resonate and can mobilize support in even the most structured and hierarchical environments. I reflected on the lessons learned. Silence in the face of abuse or manipulation allows injustice to flourish. Courage and strategy combined with documentation and accountability are essential to reclaiming control and ensuring that perpetrators face consequences. I realized that my experience was not only personal, but emblematic of broader principles, the importance of vigilance, the necessity of assertive action, and the value of cultivating both professional and personal support networks. My journey also taught me the significance of emotional resilience. The oscillation between shock, fear, strategic action, and eventual empowerment strengthened my capacity to navigate uncertainty and adversity. Each step of the process, from uncovering the irregularities in my health to orchestrating exposure and pursuing legal accountability, was a testament to the power of deliberate action and integrity. As I moved forward, I embraced a life built on the foundation of honesty, transparency, and authentic relationships. My interactions with colleagues, the support from unexpected allies, and the gradual emergence of trust in my professional and personal spheres reinforced the emotional closure I sought. I allowed myself to explore personal relationships without fear, knowing that boundaries could be respected and that manipulation could be identified and addressed. One of the most gratifying realizations was that the empowerment and justice I achieved were not only protective but transformative. I had moved from a state of fear and betrayal to one of autonomy, clarity, and strategic insight. The emotional payoff was profound. I was no longer a passive participant in my life, but an active agent shaping outcomes with intention and awareness. The contrast between the oppressive control my stepfather had attempted and the liberation I now experienced could not have been more stark. Where there had been manipulation, secrecy, and coercion, there was now transparency, trust, and self-determination. The lessons of resilience and strategic empowerment were integrated into every facet of my daily life. I also reflected on the importance of documenting experiences, seeking independent verification, and understanding institutional processes. These practices had been critical in achieving justice and ensuring that the consequences were not merely symbolic but permanent and enforceable. As I prepared for the future, I felt a renewed sense of confidence in my ability to navigate challenges with clarity and integrity. The arc of my journey from shock through betrayal, strategic action, exposure, and justice to peace was complete, yet the lessons would remain. I recognized the value of courage in the face of abuse, the importance of strategic planning, and the necessity of maintaining vigilance and autonomy. Looking back, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for my own resilience, for the support of allies, and for the mechanisms of accountability that had allowed justice to prevail. My peace was hard-won, but it was genuine and it was permanent. I could now embrace life fully confident in my ability to protect myself, make informed decisions, and foster relationships built on mutual respect and integrity. The final reflection was not just a summation of events, but a testament to the power of agency, courage, and accountability. I understood that injustice thrives in silence, and that standing up, documenting, and pursuing truth, even when difficult, is essential. The lessons learned were clear. Fear can be transformed into action. Betrayal can be met with strategy and integrity, and justice, when pursued deliberately, can restore autonomy, dignity, and peace. And so, as I look forward, I carry the knowledge that I am no longer defined by the manipulations of the past, but by the courage, strategy, and integrity that allowed me to reclaim my life, protect my health, and restore both personal and professional sovereignty. My journey serves as a reminder to anyone listening that silence is never safe when facing injustice. Speak, act, and protect yourself. Accountability is achievable and peace is possible when courage meets preparation. Have you ever uncovered a secret that changed everything in your life? Maybe it was a truth you never expected to hear, a betrayal you never imagined, or a discovery that made you question everything you thought you knew. I want to hear your story. Sharing it in the comments could help someone else feel less alone, someone who might be going through their own challenges right now. Take a moment to reflect and write it down. Don't hold back. Every story matters, and your experience could inspire, warn, or guide someone else. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button. Liking the video helps YouTube know you're interested in stories like this, so we can bring more real-life experiences, lessons, and emotional journeys directly to you. Every like not only supports the channel, but also encourages the sharing of powerful stories that can make a difference in people's lives. And make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Subscribing ensures you won't miss any new stories, insights, or moments of truth that explore courage, justice, and personal empowerment. We post stories regularly that highlight resilience, family dynamics, and the struggles people face in extraordinary circumstances, all told in a way that's raw, real, and relatable. Sharing this video with friends or family who would find it meaningful is another simple way to help. You never know who might need to hear a story about facing betrayal, standing up for yourself, or reclaiming your life. Your share could reach someone who feels trapped or powerless, and maybe it will give them the courage to take the first step toward their own empowerment. I want this to be a space where people feel comfortable connecting, sharing, and learning from one another. So after you comment your story, take a moment to read what others have written. Respond if you can, encourage if you feel moved, and connect with people who understand that life can be complicated, painful, and yet full of moments where courage and clarity can change everything. Remember, the greatest act of love you can give yourself is to honor your truth. Speak up, protect yourself, and embrace the life you deserve. And when you do come back here, share that moment and inspire someone else to do the same. So tell me, have you ever uncovered a secret that changed everything? Comment your story below, like the video, subscribe for more stories, and share it with anyone who could benefit from hearing it today. Your story, your voice, and your courage can make a difference.